Hello, welcome back to this next training session. And today I want to discuss with you some core principles in developing interventions for young people who have experienced complex trauma. And we're going to be basing today's session entirely on this article that's about to pop up on the screen right now. There we go. So 8 core principles of neurobiologically informed interventions for trauma from childhood maltreatment. This is a 2019 article, so it's based on recent neuroscience data. And you know what? This article actually quite nicely explains how it is that children exposed to threatening environments develop a threat physiology, and how this threat physiology is activated on a regular basis. And that's a big main point for a lot of my sessions, that it is the physiology of these children is very different to the physiology of typically developing children. The trauma has had an impact on the body, on the brain. So this is really about these young kids being in this survival brain zone that we've been talking about. Over time, this threat physiology only becomes stronger and it becomes more sensitive to activation. So, when we understand complex trauma and neuroscience in this way, we are, as clinicians, as carers, as professionals, in a much better position to identify these dysregulated and chaotic behaviors as more than just conduct problems. Its origin is physiological in nature. This is very important in complex trauma. This threat physiology is actually an appropriate adaptation to ensure survival. When this survival physiology gets stimulated regularly, it remains strong, it remains dominant. So don't be thrown by the aggression. Don't be thrown by the dysregulation. Don't be thrown by the swearing, by the agitation. What gets stimulated regularly will remain dominant to ensure survival. And this is exactly what's happening with these kids. What you see manifest in front of you is how trauma impacts the neurological and physiological development of that child. The area of developmental trauma is being increasingly viewed through the lens of neuroscience. And a number of foundational principles underpin this approach. So let's go ahead and discuss these 8 principles. Okay, so number 1 is social affiliation, attachment, and empathy are essential for healthy neurodevelopment. Okay, so social affiliation, attachment, and empathy affect how the brain develops. In children, the main social affiliation mechanism is parental attachment. Positive attachment relationships are associated with resilience. They're associated with emotion regulation. But poor attachment elevates stress reactivity in an infant's brain. Secure attachments protect infants against early life stresses. The brain of an infant is highly reactive to stimulation. And this is a positive feature because it means that the infant will learn from its world. So it'll learn to walk, it'll learn to talk, it'll learn to self-regulate, right? It's a positive feature. But if the environment is not a nurturing one, it means that it will also be impacted by whatever is going on in its environment. So it means that if the environment is not a nurturing one, this is also going to have an impact on the infant's brain, right? And not a positive one. So if the infant's brain receives signals of high threat, the brain adapts accordingly to survive. And then, in this case, it will adopt a hyperreactive stress response. So this is important. What I'm about to say right now is really important. The neurodevelopmental needs of a child, of an infant who is coming from a positive attachment is very different to the neurodevelopmental needs of an infant or a child that is coming from a poor attachment environment. The neurodevelopmental needs of children are different depending on the level of nurture of their environments. A child developing in a low attachment, high threat environment is in very little need of adaptive responses that promote social affiliation. It's in very little need of adaptive responses that promote connectedness, or even less so of skills that will advance them academically. This is not the stuff that they need. They need survival skills. So what does this principle mean for interventions? It means that interventions must address attachment. They need to address relationships. They need to address social affiliations. When the trauma is relational in nature, the intervention, the healing is very likely to need to be relational in nature as well. That's principle number 1. So the second principle is about sequential brain development. The brain develops in sequence from the lower order, so least complex structures of the brain stem, through to higher order, more complex structures of the cortex. Lower regions focus on regulation and sensory motor tasks. Higher order regions focus on more complex social and cognitive function. The earlier the trauma, the lower the region of the brain that is primarily impacted. The problem for the thinking brain then is the cortical functioning of the brain, is that without appropriate subcortical brain development in the lower regions of the brain, the thinking brain structures will lack scaffolding and structural integrity to fully develop its own functional capacity. And in addition, not only is brain development from bottom up, it also develops on a trajectory from right to left, etc. A great focus of our very first training session, if you want to go back to that and listen to that again, was on the impact of complex trauma on the right hemisphere, which is the dominant hemisphere in the first few years of life. So interventions, knowing this, interventions need to take into consideration both vertical as well as horizontal or horizontally sequenced development trajectories. The third principle is use-dependent neurodevelopment. I'm sure you've heard neurons that fire together, wire together. This is something really similar. Brains are developmentally and functionally use-dependent, right? And that means that they will adapt based on which structures and systems continue to be stimulated, and these brain regions will become dominant. The ones that are continually stimulated will become dominant. Those less active structures and those less active pathways will remain immature, will remain underdeveloped, and at a deficit. So key to interventions is trying to break down, so the breakdown of maladaptive and dominant pathways before we make attempts at improving the deficit network. The fourth principle is neuroplasticity, right? The brain, it can change, but what we need to remember is that plasticity processes will always prioritize surviving over thriving. And what does this mean for therapy? The underlying principle of neurobiologically based intervention is that neural pathways and neural functions can be manipulated to shift maladaptive pathways and make way for more functional networks. But plasticity processes will always prioritize surviving before thriving. If we want to change the way in which a brain functions, we have to remove the threat. We have to increase safety. It is only this way that we can take advantage of the brain's plasticity. So we need a threat-free, safe, stable, nurturing, and highly predictable environment, and this is not always possible. We can definitely do this within our relationships though. Our relationships can be predictable. Our relationships can be safe, they can be nurturing, they can be stable. Even if the client or the patient's environments are not. And this is not to say that we don't work with the agencies caring for these young people in reducing threat. Yes, we do. We do. But we also create it within our own relationship. And this is the most therapeutic thing that you can do. Our relationships with the young people need to be safe. They need to be nurturing. They need to be highly predictable. Unconditional positive regard and trust between therapist and the client is the single most accurate predictor of achieving beneficial outcomes from therapeutic interventions. In therapy, in your relationship with the young person, ensure that you engage in an environment and in a manner that offers a sense of safety and security and predictability. This is essential in order to promote successful change in line with the fundamental objectives of neuroplasticity priority. Priority is safety. So in line with this, fundamental objectives of neuroplasticity priority is that we need to create safety. Otherwise, we won't be able to change the brain. And if it means we need to slow down, then we slow down, because that brain is not going to feel safe with us straight away. That brain needs to learn that this relationship, unlike many other relationships, unlike most of the relationships it's experienced, this one is actually safe. So when we don't do this, we run the risk of inadvertently contributing to maintaining a neurological state of survival that sustains that child's trauma, and it may actually prime the young person to further trauma. So safety above all. Plasticity processes will always prioritize surviving over thriving. The fifth principle is that neuroarchitecture mirrors neuroarchaeology. The structure and function of the brain mirrors the developmental influences of early life. Our history of neurological stimulation, this is what we mean by neuroarchaeology, is reflected in our neurological structure and function. And this is what we mean by neuroarchitecture. So this means that all of our behaviors, our thoughts, the way in which we have adapted, our belief system, our cognitions, our adaptations to our experiences, and this experience impacts the use-dependent structural and functional development of the brain. So this principle is why we need to obtain a detailed history of the patient. This is why, where we can, I am very mindful that this isn't always possible, but this is why we try, and where we can, it is important to learn about the child's trauma. It may not be directly from the child that we learn the trauma, but from the agencies working with the child. This principle underpins the clinical importance of obtaining as detailed a patient history as possible. Many clinicians don't know enough about the child's trauma, and it is important to know that history, because that trauma has shaped that child's behavior. It has shaped their thoughts. The neural patterns in their brains have been impacted by that trauma. Their behaviors, their physiological and physical functions are a window into the way in which that child's brain and nervous system has been organized. I've said in a previous training session, always ask yourself, what does that behavior tell me about their world? And this is what I mean. This is it. It is a window into how their brains and nervous systems have been organized, into how that behavior right there has ensured survival for them. Understanding the relationship between life experience and neural structures and function allows for more accurate intervention. Principle number 6. Intervention sequence must mirror neurodevelopmental sequence. Just as higher order association cortices develop off the back of lower order sensory motor structures, interventions aimed at repairing maltreatment-induced neurodevelopmental impairments should also follow a similar sequence. This means that when a child displays hypervigilance, hypermotility, inability to maintain singular focus, when they are bouncing off the walls, they are showing a dysregulated autonomic response which is consistent with brainstem dysregulation. So that any attempt to work at a cognitive or affective level with this presentation will be unsuccessful because they lack the functional capacity to engage in prefrontal or limbic regulation processes. They can't do it. You need to address that brainstem. You need to address that autonomic hyperarousal before intentional cognitive therapeutic processes are engaged. Intervention sequence must mirror neurodevelopmental sequence. Our seventh principle is that formal intervention is not always the best policy. And by formal, we mean diving straight into the trauma in the conventional ways a therapist would. Let's sit down and talk about what happened. That's what we mean by formal intervention. So especially with so many of the children that we see, the non-clinical needs are equally as important to the success of any intervention. And this is why casework is so critical. The first stage of intervention will always be attending to immediate needs. So for long-term positive change, there needs to be a sense of safety, stability, and predictability. Providing help with immediate needs will allow the establishment of safety, of regulation, of stability, and of predictability. By addressing immediate safety needs like shelter, food, medical needs, we are creating a platform for natural healing to occur. This is therapeutic. When we do intervene in these ways, this is also therapeutic. Despite maybe as clinicians feeling that, only formal intervention is where we play a role when it comes to complex trauma, or anyone really. That brainstem as an attempt to calm and contain that survival brain. If basic needs are not met, that survival brain will not be contained. Our very last principle: prevention is better than cure. Working with these kids often means that we are crisis driven, that we attend to issues after the fact. This is sometimes true for casework, and I understand that it is hard to keep up with a young person, but we must get into a place where we can begin to prevent some high-risk situations. We need to prevent the risk of ongoing relational trauma. And we can do that by working with families, by monitoring contact, by engaging with the young person so that the intergenerational nature of that trauma stops with them. Prevention, we can create and prevent through building resilience. Prevention through building resilience. Helping them develop a reserve in their regulation capacity. Resilience develops from our ability to predict our environments, to understand the cause and effect relationships within our environments. This is something we can help with as clinicians. Being able to read people, to differentiate between the subtle nuances and variations of behaviors and communications. Being able to predict and to evaluate risk. That's important. Resilience can also be built through intimate connections, everyday connections, encountered throughout the day. I hope that was helpful. If you want a copy of the article, if you can't get it yourself for whatever reason, send me an email and I'm more than happy to send it to you. But that's it for today, and that's a short one. See you next time.